"I'm sorry, your name isn't on the guest list," the receptionist said coldly. She didn't know he had funded half of the event. The music from the string quartet didn't stop, but the laughter did. It started slow, then it spread. Olivia Bennett stood frozen under the crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Foundation Gala in downtown Manhattan, holding a black envelope with her name embossed in silver. She had been invited. "Personally, I'm not an assistant," she said calmly. A woman in diamonds looked her up and down. "Then you're clearly lost." More chuckles. At the center of the attention stood Alexander Whitmore, heir to Whitmore Holdings, future CEO, and tonight's golden host. His tailored tuxedo fit like power itself. He watched the scene unfold without stepping in. Olivia felt every eye measuring her dress. Elegant but simple. No luxury label screaming status. No bodyguard. No visible wealth. The coordinator held up a tablet. "You're not on the executive list. Check the private confirmations," Olivia replied. Alexander finally moved closer. His expression wasn't cruel. It was analytical. "Miss Bennett. Olivia Bennett." He repeated the name softly, as if searching his memory. "Nothing. This section is reserved for board members and equity partners," he said smoothly. "If there's been confusion, we'll escort you to general seating." General seating? Near the back. Behind the pillars. Behind relevance. Olivia's grip tightened slightly on the envelope. "Whitmore Holdings sent for me." A quiet murmur passed through nearby guests. Alexander gave a polite half-smile. "We don't usually invite—" The coordinator interrupted him, her voice suddenly uncertain. "Sir, she's listed under confidential guest approval." Silence. Alexander's jaw shifted slightly. "Approved by whom?" he asked. The coordinator swallowed. "By Mr. Whitmore Sr. That changed everything." A few heads turned. Because there was only one person in this building powerful enough to override protocol without explanation. Olivia didn't smile. She didn't need to. Alexander studied her again, this time differently. Not as a mistake, as a question. "My father rarely makes confidential approvals," he said carefully. "I know," Olivia replied. "And you'd like to sit in the investor section?" "I'd like to sit where I belong." A bold answer. The room had gone almost quiet now. Curiosity replaced mockery. Alexander stepped aside, gesturing toward the reserved tables. "Then please," he said, "join us." Olivia walked past the same people who had laughed minutes earlier. Whispers followed her. Who is she? Why would his father invite her? What does she want? She took her seat at the investor table. Not in the back, not hidden, directly across from Alexander Whitmore. On stage, the host began speaking about innovation, expansion, and the future of global logistics. Olivia listened carefully, because she already knew something the room didn't. Whitmore Holdings wasn't expanding. It was quietly collapsing, and the only reason she was sitting here tonight was because she held the solution. "Whitmore Holdings is not expanding," Olivia said quietly as the applause from the opening speech faded. "It's suffocating under hidden debt." Alexander didn't react immediately. Around them, investors clinked glasses, unaware that the company's future was being dissected at table 7. "That's a serious accusation," he said calmly, "especially from someone who hasn't introduced her position." Olivia folded her hands on the table. "I don't have a position yet." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Then how would you know anything about our internal structure?" "Because your suppliers are nervous," she replied. "2 of them extended payment cycles last quarter. One of them is preparing an exit." Alexander's expression sharpened. "That information wasn't public." "You're guessing," he said. "No," she answered. "I'm tracking patterns." The stage lights dimmed slightly as a presentation began behind them. Charts, projections, promises of international expansion. Olivia didn't look at the screen. "You're presenting growth in Southeast Asia," she continued. "But your liquidity ratio dropped 12% in 6 months. That expansion can't sustain itself." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her with new intensity. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "Someone who reads what others ignore." At the head table, Edward Whitmore, Alexander's father, briefly glanced toward them. His gaze lingered on Olivia. Alexander noticed. "You spoke with my father before tonight," he said. "Yes. And what exactly did you offer him?" "Options." A server poured champagne between them. Neither touched it. Olivia reached into her clutch and slid a slim folder across the table. Alexander hesitated before opening it. Inside were projections, debt restructuring models, acquisition targets, timeline adjustments, precise, calculated, dangerous. If you spin off your failing freight division within 90 days, she said softly, you avoid a 30% valuation drop next year. Alexander's jaw tightened. That division was his project, his leadership initiative. You're assuming it will fail. I'm certain. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. And if you're wrong, I'm not. Confidence without arrogance. It unsettled him. Music swelled again as donors applauded another announcement. No one at their table noticed that Alexander Whitmore had stopped smiling. You think you can walk into my event? He said quietly. Insult my company and expect gratitude? Olivia met his gaze evenly. I think your father invited me because he knows I'm right. As if summoned by the words, Edward Whitmore stood from the head table and began walking toward them. Conversation softened as he passed. Alexander felt the shift before it happened. His father didn't stop beside him. He stopped beside Olivia. Miss Bennett, Edward said calmly, I believe it's time we continue our discussion upstairs. The room went still. Alexander looked at his father. Upstairs? Edward nodded once. Yes, he said. Before the board realizes how serious this really is. Before the board realizes how serious this really is, Edward Whitmore repeated, his voice calm but firm. The words didn't just reach Olivia. They hit Alexander. Hard. Upstairs meant the executive floor. Private conference room. No assistants. No advisors. No performance. Only truth. Alexander stood slowly. Father, I should be included. Edward looked at him for a long second. You will be. The elevator ride was silent. Olivia stood between them, composed, her reflection steady in the mirrored walls. Alexander watched her carefully now. Not as an intruder, but as a variable he hadn't calculated. When the doors opened, they stepped into the executive conference room overlooking Manhattan's skyline. Edward closed the door himself. Speak freely, he said to Olivia. She didn't waste time. Your freight division is draining capital. Through inflated operating, costs and outdated contracts. It looks profitable on paper because liabilities are being deferred. Alexander's voice sharpened. Deferred legally. Deferred dangerously, she corrected. Edward remained still. Olivia walked to the screen mounted on the wall and connected her tablet. Charts appeared instantly. Red trends, declining margins, rising exposure. If fuel prices increase even 8% next quarter, she continued, you breach internal debt thresholds. Alexander stepped closer to the display. His heartbeat slowed, the way it did when something serious was unfolding. Those projections aren't public, he said. I built them from supplier data, port activity, and shipping volume discrepancies. Edward finally spoke. And your solution? Spin off the division before the market senses instability, quietly. Then acquire Northbridge. Transit while its valuation is suppressed. Alexander frowned. Northbridge rejected our partnership proposal last year. Yes, Olivia said, because you offered control. And you're suggesting? A merger structured through a holding vehicle. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. You've already approached them. Yes. Alexander turned to her fully. On whose authority? My own. Silence. Edward studied her more intensely now. Why would Northbridge entertain discussions without leverage? Olivia held his gaze. Because I own 28% of it. The air shifted. Alexander blinked once. That's not possible. I acquired shares over 5 months through layered investment groups. Edward's voice lowered. That level of capital requires backing. It required foresight, she replied. Alexander felt something he rarely felt. Uncertainty. You planned this, he said. Yes. From the beginning? Yes. Edward moved toward the window, staring at the city below. If what you're saying is accurate, he said slowly, then Whitmore Holdings isn't expanding. No, Olivia answered. It's exposed. Alexander exhaled carefully. And what? Edward asked without turning around. Do you want in return? Olivia didn't hesitate. A controlling position in the new logistics structure. Alexander's head snapped toward her. You're asking for ownership, he said sharply. I'm asking for protection, she replied. Edward turned back, eyes unreadable. And if we refuse? Olivia's voice remained steady. Then the market will discover the weakness before you can contain it. The The room fell into heavy silence. For the first time in years, Alexander realized something unsettling. The most dangerous person in the building wasn't sitting on the board. She was standing in front of him. "The market will discover the weakness before you can contain it," Olivia repeated, her tone calm enough to make the warning feel inevitable rather than dramatic. Alexander stepped forward, tension sharpening his voice. "Are you threatening to leak internal vulnerabilities?" "I don't need to," she replied. "The numbers will leak themselves." Edward Whitmore watched both of them carefully. "Explain," he said. Olivia tapped the screen again. A new chart appeared. Shipping delays, supplier credit tightening, bond yield fluctuations. "You have analysts who track quarterly performance," she said. "I track behavioral signals. Your European carriers are quietly reducing exposure. Your insurers adjusted premiums last month." Alexander's jaw tightened. That adjustment had been buried in a footnote. "If one hedge fund connects those signals," she continued, "short positions begin. Your stock drops. Confidence cracks." Edward folded his hands behind his back. "And you believe this happens within 60 days? "Yes." Alexander crossed his arms. "You're assuming worst-case scenarios. I'm calculating inevitabilities." Silence. Edward turned toward his son. "How exposed are we?" Alexander hesitated, only briefly. "More than we disclosed at the gala," he admitted. That was the first honest sentence of the night, Olivia noticed. "You built the freight expansion personally," she said, looking at him. "You believed scale would protect you." "It still can," Alexander replied sharply. "Not without restructuring." Edward walked back to the table and sat down slowly. "If we agree to your structure," he said, "you receive equity in the new logistics entity." "Yes, and board access." "Yes." Alexander stared at her. "You walk into our gala, get mistaken for staff, and now you expect to become part owner of our recovery?" Olivia's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't come for an apology." The words landed heavier than they should have. Edward exhaled quietly. "You knew you'd be dismissed tonight." "Yes, and you allowed it." "Yes. Why?" Olivia looked directly at Alexander. "Because I needed to see how leadership behaves under assumption." Alexander felt that, not as an insult, as a mirror. Downstairs, applause echoed faintly through the ceiling as the charity pledges were announced. Up here, something far more valuable was on the table. Edward leaned forward. "You understand that if you're wrong," he said carefully, "this damages your credibility permanently. And if you're right," he continued, "you reshape the direction of Whitmore Holdings." "Yes." The room went quiet. Alexander studied her one last time, not as an outsider, not as a guest, as leverage. Edward finally spoke. "Draft the framework," he said. 48 hours. Olivia nodded once. As she gathered her tablet, Alexander asked the question he'd been holding back. "Why us?" She paused at the door. "Because if Whitmore falls," she said softly, "the damage won't stop with you." And for the first time that night, Alexander realized she wasn't just trying to rise, she was trying to prevent something much bigger from collapsing. "If Whitmore falls, the damage won't stop with you," Olivia said quietly, the words lingering in the glass-walled conference room long after she finished. Alexander followed her into the hallway. "You speak like you're protecting the market," he said, his tone controlled but tight. "Why would you care?" Olivia didn't slow her pace. "Because your freight network supports half the independent distributors in the Northeast. If you collapse, they collapse. That's business," he replied. "That's livelihoods." The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside alone. For the first time since the gala began, there were no witnesses. "You built this plan before you ever stepped into that ballroom," Alexander said. "Yes." "You anticipated resistance." "Yes." "And humiliation." A small pause. "Yes." He studied her reflection in the mirrored wall. "Most people would have left." "I'm not most people." The elevator descended quietly. When the doors opened onto the gala floor, the energy had shifted. Word traveled fast in powerful rooms. People were watching them now. Not laughing. Watching. Edward had already returned to the head table. Investors leaned toward him, whispering. Questions were forming. Alexander stopped Olivia before she rejoined the crowd. If this becomes public too soon, he said, our stock fluctuates immediately. It won't, she replied. You sound certain. I've already prepared stabilization capital. His eyes sharpened. From where? A private consortium that prefers discretion. That includes you? Yes. Alexander let out a slow breath. You're not just offering advice, he said. You're positioning yourself as essential. I am essential, she answered. Across the room, a board member approached Edward urgently, clearly sensing something beneath the polished speeches and charity pledges. Alexander glanced toward them, then back at Olivia. You understand the board won't welcome you. I don't need welcome, she said calmly. I need votes. And if they block you, then your 60-day window closes faster than you think. The music softened as the final keynote began. Applause filled the ballroom again, but this time it sounded different to Alexander. Less celebratory, more fragile. Olivia stepped toward the investor table. 48 hours, she reminded him. And if I decide you're wrong? He asked. She looked at him, not with defiance, but with quiet certainty. Then in 60 days, she said, you'll remember this conversation. She walked away. Alexander remained standing, the noise of the gala fading behind his thoughts. For the first time in years, he wasn't controlling the trajectory of his own company. Someone else had entered the equation, and she wasn't asking for permission. She was preparing for impact. You're overreacting, board member Harold Green said sharply the next morning, tossing the draft framework onto the polished oak table. We don't restructure based on a consultant's fear. She's not a consultant, Alexander replied evenly. And this isn't fear. The emergency board session had been called before markets opened. 12 members, no assistants, no leaks. Edward Whitmore sat at the head of the table, silent. Harold adjusted his glasses. A 28% stake in Northbridge Transit, acquired quietly, that alone should concern us. It concerns me, another director muttered. Alexander stood and activated the screen. Charts filled the wall. Fuel volatility, delayed receivables, tightening credit lines. Our freight division's margin dropped 6% this quarter, he said. Projected to reach 11% next. Harold scoffed. Temporary fluctuation. Not temporary, a voice said from the doorway. Every head turned. Olivia Bennett stepped into the room. No hesitation, no apology. Security had clearly been instructed not to stop her. Harold's expression darkened. This is a private session. Yes, Edward said calmly, and she's invited. Olivia walked to the end of the table and placed a second folder down. I assume you've reviewed the initial framework, she said. We reviewed it, Harold snapped. We reject it. You reject survival? She asked calmly. Murmurs rose around the table. Harold pointed at the screen. You're exaggerating exposure to justify ownership. Olivia tapped her tablet. A new graph appeared. Real-time commodity pricing. If fuel closes above this threshold by Friday, she said, your freight division breaches internal coverage ratios. Silence. One director leaned forward. How do you have that forecast? Because I monitor the same hedge movements that are quietly building short positions against you. The room stiffened. Alexander's eyes flicked to his father. Edward finally spoke. Is that accurate? Olivia nodded. 3 funds, small positions now, testing volatility. Harold laughed nervously. Speculation. No, she said, preparation. Alexander felt the shift happening, not emotional, but mathematical. What exactly are you proposing? Another board member asked carefully. Olivia met their gaze. Immediate spin-off announcement, preemptive restructuring narrative, simultaneous merger disclosure with Northbridge. Harold's voice lowered. And your equity? Contingent on performance metrics. Edward leaned back slightly. You're willing to tie ownership to results? Yes. Alexander turned toward her. Defined results. Defined outcomes, she corrected. The room grew quieter. Harold looked around the table, sensing hesitation among allies. This is reckless, he insisted. We don't hand leverage to an outsider. Olivia didn't raise her voice. You already lost leverage, she said. I'm offering recovery. The statement settled heavily. Outside the boardroom, market bells would ring in less than 30 minutes. Inside, Whitmore Holdings stood at a crossroads. Edward looked at his son. Recommendation? he asked. Alexander held Olivia's gaze for a long moment. Then he spoke. We proceed. The word hung in the air like a trigger pulled, and for the first time since the gala, the laughter was gone completely. We proceed. The words echoed heavier than anyone expected. Harold Green stood abruptly. You're gambling the company on projections. I'm preventing a collapse, Alexander replied. Edward didn't raise his voice. Sit down, Harold. The room obeyed the tone, not the words. Olivia remained standing at the end of the table, watching the shift in power happen in real time. Markets open in 12 minutes, she said calmly. If you announce restructuring before volatility spikes, you control the narrative. And if we don't? A director asked. She didn't hesitate. Then someone else does. Alexander walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. Morning light reflected off steel and glass towers, symbols of stability that could fracture, faster than people believed. He turned back. Draft the announcement, he said to legal counsel. Strategic restructuring, strengthening long-term logistics position. Harold exhaled sharply. You're legitimizing her. No, Alexander replied. I'm legitimizing survival. Olivia stepped forward slightly. The merger terms must be disclosed simultaneously. A few board members exchanged looks. You're moving fast, one of them said. Yes, she answered. Because the market moves faster. Edward folded his hands. Ownership structure? Olivia slid a final document across the table. Performance-based equity. If revenue stabilization meets projected thresholds within 2 quarters, my stake converts. Harold scanned the paper. And if it fails? I absorb loss on my Northbridge position. Silence. That wasn't a bluff. Alexander studied her carefully. You're risking your own capital. Yes. Why? She met his eyes without hesitation. Because I don't invest unless I'm certain. The room grew still. A notification sound broke the silence. Market pre-open activity. One of the finance directors checked his screen. His expression changed. Fuel futures just spiked, he muttered. Olivia didn't react. Alexander's pulse slowed, not raced. He understood what that meant. Harold looked uneasy now. Coincidence. Trend, Olivia corrected. Edward stood. We vote, he said. Hands lifted slowly around the table. Not unanimous, but enough. Edward nodded once. Motion carried. The legal team moved immediately. Statements drafted. Communications prepared. PR alerts queued. Alexander walked toward Olivia as controlled chaos unfolded around them. You timed this perfectly, he said quietly. I calculated it, she replied. Down on Wall Street, screens began flashing early indicators. Inside the boardroom, a different realization settled over him. The woman who had been mistaken for staff less than 24 hours ago was now shaping the future of Whitmore Holdings. And if she was right, this wouldn't just be a recovery, it would be a takeover disguised as rescue. Release it, Edward said. At exactly 9:29 a.m., Whitmore Holdings issued a pre-market announcement. Strategic restructuring, freight division spin-off, pending merger discussions to strengthen global logistics stability. 30 seconds later, the market opened. Inside the boardroom, screens lit up in synchronized motion. Whitmore stock dipped, then steadied. Harold leaned forward, watching the numbers tick. Too early to celebrate. I'm not celebrating, Olivia said calmly. Watch the shorts. Alexander's eyes moved across the live data feed. 2 hedge funds increased positions. Testing. Then something shifted. Northbridge Transit released its own statement. Confirmed merger discussions. Cited long-term strategic alignment. A murmur spread across the table. That was coordinated, one director whispered. Yes, Olivia said. Whitmore's stock stopped falling, stabilized, then edged upward. Harold's jaw tightened. Temporary bounce. But 10 minutes later, financial media outlets began picking up the narrative. Whitmore strengthens logistics arm. Proactive restructuring move. Strategic merger underway. The story had flipped. Instead of exposure, it looked like foresight. Alexander felt it. The subtle but powerful change in tone. Edward watched the numbers quietly. After 20 minutes, fuel futures crossed the exact threshold Olivia had projected. A director refreshed the internal risk dashboard. If we hadn't announced, he began. We'd be reacting instead of leading, Alexander finished. Harold said nothing. Olivia didn't smile. She simply observed. Another alert flashed. Short positions began closing. The room exhaled almost in unison. Whitmore stock rose 3.8% by mid-morning. Not explosive, but controlled. Stable, Alexander turned toward Olivia. You anticipated the spike down to the minute. I anticipated human behavior, she corrected. Edward approached her slowly. You've bought us time, he said. Time is leverage, she replied. Harold finally spoke, his voice lower now. This doesn't guarantee long-term recovery. No, Olivia agreed. Execution does. Edward nodded once. Then you'll assist in overseeing implementation. It wasn't phrased as a question. Alexander studied her carefully. Yesterday, she had been laughed at in a ballroom. Today, she was guiding board-level execution, and the market was responding. Outside the glass walls, New York moved as it always did, unaware that a corporate shift had just taken place. Alexander stepped closer to her. You understand, he said quietly, that once this becomes official, you won't just be an advisor. Olivia met his gaze. I never intended to be. On the screen behind them, Whitmore's stock ticked upward again. The rescue was working. But Alexander realized something else at that moment. This wasn't just about saving the company anymore. It was about who would control it when the dust settled. Control was never the goal. Olivia said later that afternoon as the emergency implementation team gathered in the executive strategy room. Then what is? Alexander asked. Alignment. The word felt almost too calm for what was unfolding. Departments were already in motion. Legal teams drafting spin-off structures. Finance rebalancing debt exposure. Communication shaping the public narrative. Whitmore stock had closed the day up 5.1%. Not explosive, but decisive. Inside the strategy room, tension still lingered. Harold Green sat rigid in his chair. Markets can be manipulated short-term. 2 quarters will tell the truth. They will, Olivia replied evenly. That's why my equity converts only after performance metrics are met. And if they're not? He pressed. Then I lose leverage. Alexander watched her closely. There was no hesitation in her voice. No hedge. Edward folded his hands. Operational authority must be clarified. A silence followed. Olivia spoke carefully. The spin-off entity requires independent oversight. You're suggesting? Edward prompted. A new executive structure. Harold scoffed. We already have leadership. Yes, she said. Leadership that built the exposure. The room tightened. Alexander didn't interrupt. Olivia continued. The freight expansion wasn't reckless. It was mistimed. Scale without insulation. Her eyes briefly met Alexander's. It wasn't an attack. It was analysis. And your solution? Edward asked. Transitional CEO for the logistics arm. Temporary. Performance-bound. Harold's voice sharpened. And who exactly would that be? Olivia didn't look away. Me. Silence slammed into the room. Alexander felt it physically. Harold laughed once, but it sounded hollow. You expect us to hand operational control to someone who wasn't even on the payroll yesterday? I expect you to hand control to the person who prevented your valuation from collapsing this morning. Edward studied her without blinking. You understand the political fallout, he said quietly. Investors will question it. Media will dissect it. They already are, she replied. Better they dissect results. Alexander stepped forward slightly. You're asking to run the very division I built. Yes. A long pause stretched between them. And you believe you can fix it? He asked. No, she answered. The word surprised him. I know I can. Harold stood abruptly. This is outrageous. Edward didn't raise his voice. Sit down. Harold froze. Edward turned back to Olivia. 60 days, interim authority. Strict performance benchmarks. Olivia nodded once. Alexander felt the shift happening again. Not just structural. Personal. Yesterday, she had been denied a seat. Today, she was taking the wheel. And if she succeeded, Whitmore Holdings wouldn't just recover. It would belong in part to the woman who had been laughed at under crystal chandeliers. You have 60 days, Edward said firmly. No extensions. I won't need them, Olivia replied. The announcement went internal first. Whitmore Logistics Division. Interim executive leadership appointment. The reaction was immediate. Confusion, resistance, quiet panic. By noon, senior managers were whispering in corridors. She wasn't even here last week. This is temporary. It has to be. Olivia stepped into the logistics operations floor that afternoon without ceremony. No press, no entourage, just a tablet in hand and eyes that missed nothing. Alexander watched from the upper glass balcony overlooking the division floor. He had built this unit from a risky expansion idea into a global network, and now he had handed it over. Not because he wanted to, because the numbers demanded it. Inside the operations room, Olivia called for the top 6 department heads. They gathered reluctantly. "We don't have time for introductions," she began. "We have inefficiencies draining $4.2 million per month." A murmur. "That figure isn't public," one manager said cautiously. "It is now," she replied. She projected a breakdown onto the main screen. Duplicated vendor contracts, idle fleet hours, underutilized storage hubs. 3 distribution centers operate below 60% capacity, she continued. 2 can be consolidated within 30 days. That would require renegotiation, another executive argued. It will require urgency. Alexander descended from the balcony slowly, listening. Olivia continued without pause. Fuel hedging contracts must be restructured. Your current agreements lock you into exposure. One manager shook his head. That's a complex unwind. So is bankruptcy, she said calmly. Silence. Alexander stepped into the room. All eyes shifted to him. He didn't take control. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood beside her. And that changed everything. "If you have objections," Alexander said evenly, "bring solutions." No one spoke. Olivia turned to the team. "Daily performance reports," she said. "Transparent metrics, no filtered summaries. You're compressing 6 months of reform into 8 weeks," a director said. "Yes." "And if it fails?" Olivia met his eyes. "It won't." Later that evening, as most of the building emptied, Alexander remained in the conference room reviewing updated projections. Olivia entered quietly. "You didn't have to back me publicly," she said. "Yes, I did," he replied. She studied him carefully. "Why?" He closed the file slowly. "Because if you fail," he said, "we both fall." Outside the glass windows, Manhattan's lights flickered against the night sky. Inside Whitmore Holdings, control was no longer about titles. It was about execution, and the countdown had officially begun. "You're moving too fast," Harold Green said sharply during the 4th-week review meeting. "Layoffs, consolidations, contract renegotiations, morale is collapsing." "Morale collapses when leadership hesitates," Olivia replied evenly. "Not when it acts." The logistics division's performance dashboard glowed on the wall behind her. Operating losses had narrowed by 37%. Idle fleet time was down. Fuel exposure had been reduced through restructured hedging. But resistance hadn't disappeared. It had evolved. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the numbers. "They're improving," he said calmly. "Short-term optics," Harold insisted. "You've cut costs aggressively. That doesn't guarantee sustainable growth." Olivia tapped the screen again. A new projection appeared. "With consolidation complete," she said, "distribution velocity increases 18% by next quarter. That attracts higher volume contracts." Edward Whitmore watched silently. "And the workforce?" Harold pressed. "You've replaced 3 senior managers." "They were protecting inefficiency," Olivia replied. "Not performance?" The room grew tense. Harold shifted tactics. "There are rumors," he said carefully, "that you accumulated additional Northbridge shares after your appointment." Olivia didn't blink. "I did." Alexander's gaze flicked toward her. Harold smiled thinly. "So this isn't stabilization. It's acquisition. It's insulation," she corrected. Edward finally spoke. "Explain." Olivia clasped her hands calmly. "If short pressure returns, majority alignment between Whitmore Logistics and Northbridge prevents hostile interference. You're increasing your leverage," Harold said. "Yes." Silence. Alexander exhaled slowly. "What percentage?" 34. The number settled heavily. "That approach is blocking authority," Harold muttered. "Exactly," Olivia said. Edward studied her carefully. "You're protecting the structure." "Yes." "And positioning yourself to influence it permanently." "Yes." Harold leaned back. "You planned further than 60 days." "I always do." Alexander felt it again. That realization that she wasn't reacting. She was orchestrating. Edward looked at the updated performance report one last time. "Revenue stabilization target?" he asked. On track to exceed, Olivia answered. And if it does? She didn't hesitate. Then the merger finalizes under strengthened valuation. Harold shook his head slowly. You came into this building as a guest. Olivia's expression didn't change. No, she said quietly. I came as an investor. The room fell silent, because the numbers on the wall weren't arguing. They were proving. And with 2 weeks remaining in the 60-day window, Whitmore Logistics was no longer bleeding. It was accelerating. Alexander realized something then. If this trajectory held, Olivia wouldn't just earn equity. She would earn permanence. 60 days after she was laughed at under crystal chandeliers. The boardroom was silent for a very different reason. The performance report glowed on the wall. Revenue stabilization target, exceeded by 12%. Operational efficiency, up 21%. Debt exposure reduced. Stock valuation climbing steadily. No red, no emergency alerts, just results. Edward Whitmore closed the final report slowly. The benchmarks have been met. No one argued, not even Harold. Alexander stood beside the window overlooking Manhattan, the same skyline that had witnessed the first confrontation. It's official, Edward continued. The merger with Northbridge finalizes at revised valuation. Equity converts as agreed. All eyes turned to Olivia. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded once, because this had never been about applause. It had been about execution. Harold cleared his throat. Your equity position places you as the largest individual stakeholder in the logistics entity. Yes, Olivia replied calmly. And with your Northbridge holdings, he added carefully. You now hold decisive influence. Silence followed. Edward stood and extended his hand. Welcome to the board, he said. This time, there was no hesitation in the room. No laughter. No whispers. Olivia shook his hand. Alexander stepped forward next. You didn't just rescue the division, he said quietly. You rebuilt it. You let me, she replied. He shook his head slightly. You forced us to see what we ignored. A faint pause settled between them. 60 days ago, she had been mistaken for staff. Tonight, there was no gala. No orchestra, no spotlight, just a signed agreement placed neatly on polished wood. Ownership, control, earned. As the meeting adjourned, board members exited with measured respect. Harold passed her without speaking, but without dismissal. Progress came in many forms. Alexander lingered. You knew that night, he said when they laughed, that this would be the outcome. Olivia gathered her tablet. I knew the numbers, she answered. The rest was discipline. He studied her for a moment longer. What happens now? She looked around the boardroom, no longer as a guest, not even as a temporary executive, but as an owner. Now, she said calmly, we expand. Outside, the city lights flickered against the dark sky. Whitmore Holdings had not collapsed. It had evolved, and the woman who had been humiliated in front of everyone came back as the owner.